Hello, and welcome to a Nevada Historical Society Docent Council program. We're a group of volunteers who volunteer for the Nevada Historical Society in Reno, Nevada. Today's program is Nevada Barn Heritage, and the speaker is Jack Hursh. He's going to talk about the Northern Nevada historic barn architecture with his photographs during a time window 1995 to 2005. This was a period of rapid development in the Reno area. Most of the subjects that Jack will show have been displaced by development. Jack is a fourth-generation Nevadan, an award-winning photographer, influenced by the desire to preserve images reflecting the heritage of Nevada. Jack began photographing local historic barns in the 1990s, when Reno's rapid development was tearing down many of the historical ranch sites. I know you're going to enjoy this program, and I'm going to turn it over to Jack.
Thanks everybody for joining me here this morning, and I'm going to sort of have two different phases in this slideshow, and indeed Nevada Barn Heritage. I will then finish with the story of us rescuing those little buildings that are now at Bartley Ranch Park. And as Carol said, I have spent many a time out in the field exploring and taking photographs, and I was particularly inspired in the mid 1990s because all of us know that Reno was experiencing a big boom in building and development, and a lot of our local historical ranch sites were literally being bulldozed over. And so I observed this, saw all of these artifacts, these buildings disappearing at a very rapid rate. So I grabbed cameras and just got out there, literally knocked on doors, and was able to go on property and document, just photograph what was still there. And so the slideshow is just that. It's sort of an inventory of what I had seen from the time frame of about 1995 to about 2005, and then maybe a few since then. So it's not at all comprehensive. If I showed you every photo I took, we'd be here all day. This first slideshow, I want to tell a little story. We had moved the buildings to Bartley Ranch Park in May of 2004, and as we noticed before, I published this little book. It's authored by myself and Lauren John, and it's a little booklet on my photos of historical local barns and sketches by Lauren, and it's a little guide, if you will. And we have had over the years this book for sale at the Nevada Historical Society bookstore, the Sparks Heritage Museum, Sundance bookstore. And one day in the mail, about a year after the buildings had been moved to Bartley Ranch Park, was this letter from this woman who lives in San Francisco. And she and her husband had taken a bus trip to Sparks, and they were staying at the Nugget. And on their spare time, they strolled down Victorian Avenue and they went into the Sparks Heritage Museum, and they saw my little booklet, but they had to catch the bus. So they quickly bought the booklet, ran and got on the bus. And while she is riding back to San Francisco, she's reading my little book. And one of the very last pages in the book, I have this photograph of the buildings that we have on site at Bartley Ranch Park. And I have the brief description in their history. And she was flabbergasted because these buildings were her grandfather's ranch buildings. And so she wrote me this beautiful letter expressing that she was almost in tears because she had no idea that they still existed. And so that started a friendship, and we were writing back and forth and calling. And she came up and visited, and she brought this big family photo album of old photos. And as a child, she grew up in Reno, and as a child, they'd go out to the ranch. And for some of you that don't know, this ranch site is where the Lazy Boy and Ethan Allen furniture stores are located now on South Virginia Street. So it's all developed now. But as a child, in I would say late 1940s and 1950s, growing up, this was their grandparents. So they would go out the long trip from Reno out to that location in the South Meadows, and she'd spend the weekend with her grandparents, and she would play in the barn and around these outbuildings that are now at Bartley Ranch Park. This is one of the photographs that was in that family photo album, and so I chose to use this as my title slide. And so I'm saying Joe Freddo Ranch circa 1950. And this is just my introductory photo. It's a selfie, if you will, and it's me just going out in the field and just simply documenting an inventory of photographs of what was existing, like I said, from about 1995 to 2005. And so we'll start out with Carson Valley. Carson Valley has a big inventory of timber frame barns, and this is the Schneider Ranch near Jacks Valley. And so we had here in just general history, we have the big boom of the Comstock lode and the mining at Virginia City. And so that really took off in the late 1850s, really boomed in the 1860s, 1870s, started to dwindle in the 1880s. And by 1890s, Virginia City was dying. The mines had played out. But by then, guess what town was booming? Reno, of course. But in the Carson Valley, Truckee Meadows, Eagle Valley, which is where Carson City is, even as far north into the Honey Lake Valley, and actually as far north up into Lassen County, Modoc County, and other areas in Nevada, these big ranches sprang up with these huge timber frame barns, and they were raising cattle and sheep and chickens and you name it, and the big market was Virginia City. So the bulk of the photographs that I'm showing you today are these structures that date back to the Virginia City boom time frame. So you might just say a lot of these structures date back to the 1860, early 1860s. Oh. So here's the Sarman barn, and this is just defining the Nevada style of barn. We call it gable with wings. So you have a central gable with the wings off to the side. And there are a couple of advantages, you might say, for this style of barn for our location. In non-drought years in the past, we have had a lot of snowfall, and a structure of this type is very strong with large, heavy snowfalls, and it can shed the snow. And then we have very strong winds, and this style of structure also can shed the forces of wind, strong wind, those Washoe zephyrs. And so this is a very strong style of barn to construct here in northern Nevada. This is the Holden barn in Carson Valley. That's the Carson Range, same style, gable with wings. And this is a kind of my favorite marriage of a photograph with old barns and geology. We have a big rock out here in the field. It's probably a glacial erratic, meaning back in maybe 10,000 years ago when the Carson Range was more glaciated, there might have been a big flash flood and a big wash of water came down the mountainside and brought this boulder, this huge boulder, all the way out into the field. So there's quite a story there, quite a dramatic story geologically just with that boulder. And then, of course, the beautiful barn. This is the Dangberg Ranch in Carson Valley. This is a state park. The state park encompasses the house, the Dangberg house. And so if you haven't, it's a nice tour, the Dangberg house. Unfortunately, from my perspective, they did not include the barn in with the state park. And the barn is very extraordinary. And so, however, the owners of the property still use the barn. So it is in use. And we'll get on to other wagon stories later, but these are just some of the neat old hay wagons that were still parked out there behind the barn. And those are horse-drawn hay wagons. So Truckee Meadows. So this is my perhaps my favorite photo of all time. It's the little cover photo on my little barn book. And this was a barn that I you might say it haunted me. It was over on Valley Road. I stalked it. Time and time again would drive by, and I had always envisioned getting it with snow on the roof. And so one time we got a snowfall, and it was in 1998, and I swung by and got this shot. And by the time the sun had come around to the evening to get that nice light on the face of the barn, much of the snow had melted, but I got a little frosting of snow, and was always very romanced by the old horse-drawn hay wagon. Late 1800s, the Lewis family moved in, and they homesteaded. Time frame from 1860s to approximately 1920, so about 60 years. A family would occupy, and then there was the Italian immigration into Reno, and the Italian movement came in around 1900 and 1940 time frame. A lot of Italians came in, so the Oliva family came in and bought this property, approximately 1920. And so then they occupied this ranch for a number of years. And then descendants of the Olivas, the Raffetto family, then owned this property for many years. And it was the Raffettos that I made friends with. And I knocked on their front door at their house just next door. And I politely asked them if I could go take photographs of the barn. And their reaction was, "Why in the heck would you want to take a picture of that old, ugly old thing?" And which was quite comical, I thought. And so after I got this photograph, I presented them a print of that photograph at the door, and their reaction was, "Oh my God, our barn is beautiful." But of course, the barn was torn down a few years later, and now there's a big apartment complex. So that's the reality. So moving on, Mayberry Barn. This is out of the Aspen Glen Drive, out west Mayberry Drive along the Truckee River. It would be impossible for me to take this photograph now because there are a bunch of large houses built right here. But I took this photograph around 2002, if I recall correctly. And I'm going to point out, in this view of this barn, you see the large opening down at the floor level, at the ground level. There's that large dark black. That's an opening, a doorway. That is not original to this barn. That would have originally been solid. And the opening would have been way up at the gable. There would have been a hinged door, and it would have flopped down and they would load hay. And we're going to talk more about that a little later. But in modern for modern adaptive reasons, they would cut big doors down at the ground level so they could drive tractors in when baled hay became the method of hay, because this barn was built in the early 1860s. And at that time, it was all loose hay harvesting and storage. So here's on West 4th Street, the Capurro or Durkee barn. And just a little photography story. I was having lunch with my dad at the Gold and Silver, and I heard the train, and I had my camera and tripod in my truck. I heard the train going by, and I just went, "See you, Dad." And I jumped in my truck and I raced down West 4th Street. I beat the train, got my tripod set up, and I had the camera ready. And I originally composed this to have the barn on the right and the front of the train coming in on the left. And I had a shutter release cable, and when I went to go click, it was jammed. And I went, ah. And so I thought, well, actually, it's a long train. I thought about it. The cars are going by. I readjusted my camera, and I thought, I'll get the end of the train. And I had one chance and went click, and I got it. And so that was quite the lucky shot, actually. But trains and barns are both really cool things. So this is the Holcomb Ranch out on Holcomb Lane, out in the South Truckee Meadows. And this one, I'll introduce the concept. It's a gable with a slightly broken wings. And this is the Jones Ranch. This is one of and of course, Slide Mountain in the background. This is way out on Clean Water Way. And I'm actually on the Sparks side of the Truckee River, shooting across the Truckee River towards Slide Mountain. There is a thesis written, and I forgot her name, about the history of the Jones Ranch, and she had found deeds of record that actually described the barn being built in 1865. And what was unique about that is most of the barns were not on any kind of records. They were just a utility, and houses typically were on deed of record. So it's kind of hard to dig up concrete record of barns. But here's this one barn that did have deed, or it was mentioned that early in 1865. And so it supports that time frame of when these buildings were built. And of course, we have the gable with wings. And this is a close-up of the siding of that Jones barn. And note, in the center is a batten. That's a thin strip of wood that was applied later over the crack that developed between the original two pieces of wood siding. And notice off to the right and off to the left, the nails are square nails. And notice the batten in the center is held on by round nails. Well, it's like barn forensics. This tells a story. Square nails in general in Nevada are indicative of construction prior to approximately 1880. It's just kind of a general rule of thumb. And so here we know this barn was built in 1865, and indeed they used square nails. And so the boards were young in 1865. They put them edge to edge. There probably wasn't much of a crack. And then, of course, some years go on, and the boards will shrink a little bit, and that crack will expand. And then they had the concept of adding the batten later to fill in the crack, and it's just a simple form of insulation. But that little photograph tells that big of a story. And so Nevada Outback, and this is just a general overview of places beyond our big urban area in the north. So I have Smith Valley, and I just have a scenic here just to give you some context. And here's a little building I found out there in Smith Valley that they're obviously moving. And that's just a foreshadowing of my story about us moving the buildings to Bartley Ranch Park. But it brings about the point that a lot of these little buildings, instead of being torn down, can be moved. They can be rescued or preserved. And it's really not that difficult to move them. And so, and what's nice about this building too, and I'll emphasize it later also, is the good roof. Look how good that roof is, and that's key. And so here's a barn, very large timber frame barn along Desert Creek out of Smith Valley in Lyon County. And then here's a barn near Wellington in Smith Valley. And now we're going to move to Lovelock area. And so here's just a little scenic in Lovelock area, just to give you some context. And here's some shots of a couple of barns. And these are both gable with broken wing barns. And so we talk about gable with wings and gable with broken wings. And you see the concept of the broken wing. It's just those wings are set down a little lower. And there's another shot. And nice dramatic skies. And there's some nice snow up on Star Peak in the Humboldt Range. So Lovelock again. And look at the cupolas, the vents up on top of that roof. And that is an original roof there. They have not put any of the metal corrugation that you see in a lot of these photographs. So there's a story right there. Almost all of these structures would have originally had shingles like this barn. And then later on they added the corrugated tin, and then the corrugated tin rusted. So you see that tin roof rusted. And this barn never received the corrugated tin. And now we're moving on to Yarrington, just a scenic to give you context, and another shot of a big bull out there in the field, and a shot of just a little, it's a cattle shelter at a ranch. And I don't have a lot of shots in the Mason Valley, but it's just pointing out that Mason Valley is beautiful and a lot of beautiful ranch country worth exploring. And then Alpine Ranch in Edwards Creek Valley. This barn was actually a livery stable for the stagecoach operations that occurred in the late 1850s and early 1860s before the telegraph and the railroad were established. And so the mode of transportation was Pony Express and stagecoach across central Nevada, which is the Highway 50 corridor. And there were these big stables, liveries out there for fresh horses and blacksmithing to keep the stagecoaches going. And so here's a building, Squaw Valley in Elko County. And this is Soldier Meadows in Humboldt County. And this is interesting. This barn is constructed of stone. Way out in Humboldt County, there's not a lot of big timber. And so this structure is a stone structure. And then there are smaller timbers for the roof and the gates. And here's a river ranch, Quinn River Valley. And again, here is a barn that never received the corrugated tin. And it has its beautiful, original, very erratic, if you will, shapes and sizes. They probably have patched it over the years, but that's a very beautiful shingle roofed barn. Here's the Lampa Ranch near Carson City. And then a little story, we got the Winters Ranch, Washoe Valley, and this is a photo that was taken by Lyle Ball around 1970, and Lyle Ball was a photographer and artist, local artist, very well known, and one of his favorite subject materials were the old barns. And then, and part of my point here This would have been a shingle roof barn originally, and then it had tin added to the roof, and you can see that the wind is ripping off that roof there at that corner. And here is just my point that keeping a good roof on a structure like this is key, and it's really almost the number one maintenance that you can give to a building is just keeping a good roof, and that applies to your house too. So timber framing, and so here's a historical photo. I actually, seems like I found this photo in the Humboldt County Museum, but I'm not sure why. But anyway, it's just a photo demonstrating barn raising day, and a big gathering of folks from around, and putting up the barn. And each segment of a barn structure is called a bent. And you've got your post and beam construction, mortise and tenon joinery with wooden pins. You have braces, the angling braces. So all those pieces. So here are some examples of some local timber frame barns. This is the Byington Ranch near Genoa. And up in the upper center where the post comes up and makes contact, you can see a joint with a pin, and that's called a double-bladed scarf joint. And we'll talk hopefully more about some scarf joints. And if you move down where the angled braces meet into the post, you can see the two wooden pins sticking out. And so that's a mortise and tenon joint, and we'll see that some more. And here's another Carson Valley barn, and a slightly different style of post and beam construction. I'll go back to this one and see how that one was constructed, and you see how this one was constructed. So there were different styles, and it's theorized that, so we had the Comstock Lode, we had Virginia City, we're talking maybe 1860. There are all kinds of people immigrating from Europe or the eastern United States, moving to the big gold and silver rush in Virginia City. Some of these people are well trained in timber framing techniques. So there are people employed in the mines to build timber framed buildings, the mills, the square set timbering in the mines. So we have these experts at timber framing. So they're going out into the valleys where these ranches are being built, and they're also building barns for the ranches. And we have different ethnic groups. We have Germans, we have English, we have Swiss, you have these different European ethnics. And so they are bringing different techniques that they have brought from the old home. And so a German built barn is slightly different than an English built barn. And so here today in Carson Valley, you can go from barn to barn and you see these slightly different construction techniques. And there's an ethnicity to that. And then you can also go from barn to barn and they'll be exactly the same. And you can theorize that, oh, I bet the same work crew built that barn, built those two barns. And it was a different work crew that built that other barn because it's built differently. And so here's another mortise and tenon joint in the Dangberg barn. And you can see that post and beam and the mortise and the tenon coming all the way through that post, and then the three wooden pins holding that mortise and tenon joint together. And so here's the Mayberry barn again. The Mayberry barn is absolutely fantastic. It's huge. It's I think it's 96 feet long and 64 feet wide. We could probably fit 3 of our houses inside this barn. It's a huge, and the timber framing is absolutely fantastic, as you can see. And this barn dates back 1860 time frame. And there's a huge history of that ranch site, which I could give a whole slideshow on. So hewn. So here's a shot of a barn up at Doyle, California, and just a close-up of the hewn timbers. So we have a post and a beam hewn by hand, and then that mortise and tenon joint with those wooden pins holding that joint together. And one of the emphases, a thing to emphasize here, a mortise and tenon joint is held together by wood of the exact same material and the exact same pH. So there is no pH difference. And when you have 0 pH, you have 0 decay. When you have 2 materials in contact that have a large pH difference, there is an immediate decay. And this is my tongue-in-cheek joke about modern code, because how many barns, modern pole barns, have you been in, or modern buildings where you see wood being held together by metal braces, and you can already see the rust, sort of the rust marks on the wood, or the streaks on the wood. Has anybody noticed that? I have. And that is decay. And so that's because the metal that they use for modern code, holding wooden pieces together, is really not the best idea. You're instituting a pH difference, you're instilling a degree of pH decay. And so here in this photograph, we have a 160-year-old construction joint that has absolutely no decay. You notice that? And so this is one of the reasons why in Europe, there are timber frame buildings like this that are 2,000 years old, as long as they keep that good roof on them. And here's a beautiful, unique joint, and it's called a scarf joint, and it's actually angled. If you can just kind of study that a little bit, it takes several angle changes, and it allows that beam to lock into itself. And then you have a tapered key through a hole, and they pound that key right through a hole there to really lock in that scarf joint. And that makes a very strong joint, and again, neutral pH, and just keep a good roof so there's no moisture and you'll have no decay. And so here's a shot of the Willow Creek Ranch barn at Doyle. Just a side story, a contractor got a hold of me. This was in 2002, and had heard that I like to document barns. And so they were tearing this barn down, but they were utilizing all of the materials in fancy homes up at Incline Village. So literally for about 2 months in a row, every Saturday morning at like 4 in the morning, I'd get up and drive to Doyle. For those of you that don't know, it's about 50 miles north of Reno. And would photograph, and every time I went up there, they had dismantled the barn more and more and more, and it let more light in. And so at this point, the whole wing to the right had been removed, or the siding, and was letting this beautiful morning light in on this framing. And I was using slide film at that time, and you can see that's how I was able to get that cool definition of light. Anyway, a unique experience. And so here's that same barn as they're continuing to dismantle. And again, look how huge this barn is. So barn humanity. Positively, no smoking or near or in this barn. And this is Dallas Byington near Genoa, and I just call this break time with a friend. He's petting his dog. And then Ed Sarman in Carson Valley. And I'm proud to say that Ed, since I took this photograph, has passed away. And I shared this photograph, a print of it, with the family as soon as I took the photograph. And then Ed, some years later, passed away, and they used this photograph as a primary announcement and memorial at his memorial service. And I thought, that's cool. I think Ed I interviewed Ed. I spent a half a day with Ed with his barn, and he loved his barn. And so this is what he chose to use at his memorial service. And that's kind of a touching tribute there for Ed. And then this is my buddy, Lauren John. And everybody's heard of Lauren. Lauren has volunteered at the State Railroad Museum since he was 19 years old. He and I are the exact same age, 55. And then Lauren's we get in trouble. We go around saving barns, and that's what we do. And then we call it barn spelunking. And so it's kind of a partner in crime. And there's his little boy, Corby, and we're up in the loft, and we got permission to go climb around in the Scassa barn in Carson Valley. Corby's now, I think, 25 years old and in college, and you know how that goes. And so that gives me the time frame. And then this is a friend of mine, John J.O. He's a real cowboy, and I got a shot of him up in Modoc County, stepping into a big barn up there. And then livestock. And so this is just shots of livestock. Of course, barns are home for livestock. And I just call this chocolate and vanilla swirl. And then, of course, the barn yard can be staging area for branding and roping and doing what you do on ranch. And so they're roping and branding some calves here. And this tells a story. This is an old barn, and that's a sill beam. So that's a large beam that's in contact with the ground, and it's structural. So it's structural along the floor of the barn. And this is the entryway into the stalls for the horses. So in an old historical barn like this, the configuration would be the central gable was for storing the loose hay. So from peak of the gable down to the floor, they would load up loose hay for winter hay storage. And there would be a right wing and a left wing. One of the wings would be feeding cribs for feeding cattle, and cattle could come and go, and they could drop the hay into the cribs for feeding. On the other wing, there would be stalls for the workhorses, because these barns were constructed during horse-drawn era. And so all the mechanization, the hay cutters, the wagons, were all horse-drawn. So you had to have facility for the horses. So the other wing was were stalls for the horses. So this is years and years and years of horses being led in and out of the wing of the barn, and their toes clipping on the sill of that beam and wearing it down. And so there's a story right there. And so here is that exact same barn with the horse stalls. This is just another outbuilding. I just think it's comical. The cat seems very content in his or her barnyard. And this is out in Elko County. And this is Humboldt County. And I joke the hay is always greener on the other side of the fence. And a barn owl. And this is a great horned owl at the Mayberry barn. Part of the barn. A barbed wire with a beautiful weathered sun beat. That's one good thing about Nevada sun, is it leaves a beautiful patina after years and years and years on old wood and even old steel. This is in the entryway, the beam overhead when you enter the Sarman barn. That was Ed Sarman, remember him. It says M.L. Norton's barbed wire liniment, a positive cure for all outward ailments on man or beast if used according to directions on bottles, sold by dealers. So this is hilarious to me, actually. It was literally a salesman traveling around in his buggy, probably, selling his tonic from ranch to ranch, and probably got permission from the rancher to put this advertisement on the beam in the entryway of the barn. And so when they say snake oil salesman, there you go. And this is graffiti. This is just simple graffiti inside a barn, and it's just a rider. It almost looks like the rider's on a mule, but or a donkey, but and just a skull hanging on the side of a barn, and the old horseshoes. And that's a piggy, a weather vane, and with a almost Nevada-esque shotgun holes through the piggy. Nevada barn technology, and that's tongue-in-cheek. I'm just calling this Nevada barn technology, but it's just some of these simple vernacular connections made to hold doors, hold fences. This one I think is hilarious because you've got a stick touching the ground, going up, holding the top rung of the fence, and then the barbed wire going down with the horseshoe looped around the bottom rung of the fence. And if there are any of you engineers out there can do a forces diagram on that, it's pretty hilarious. I really like that. And this is a Jackson fork. It's a version of a Jackson fork. And this is what I meant going back to that Mayberry barn where I showed you the big cutout at the base, a ground floor of the Mayberry barn that's been cut out in recent years for tractors to drive into. So here's a different barn in Carson Valley. And this was the original loose hay way of getting inside the central aisle of the barn. Of course, they had small doors off to the side now, but they would pull the hay wagon up, lower this down, scoop up a big scoop of hay, pull it back up and track it back in and dump the loose hay into that central aisle. And this photograph illustrates that. And this is the very barn in Doyle that I showed you earlier that was being torn down that I got the photographs. This is a 1911 photograph of that barn. And here is the team of horses with the hay wagon. They would have gone out in the field. They would have horse-drawn, cut the hay with horse-drawn hay cutters, loose hay. They would have gone up and scooped the loose hay up into a wagon and then brought it back to the barn and using Jackson forks, pulleyed it up and into the barn and dropped it into the barn for loose hay storage for the winter to feed the livestock. And here's an example of a Jackson fork. And there's just another neat hand forged by a blacksmith's hands, a very intricate device, really, with a little lock on there to just simply hold the door of a barn. And this is a hitching ring where you tie a horse to the side of the barn. And it's, again, another simple blacksmith made by hand piece. And here's a wheel trolley that suspends a door for a barn on a track, so you can just slide the barn door open and back. Here's another close-up of, you might say, vernacular barn door hook and handle construction. And the hole, this is right at the corner of a barn, and there's another hook. If you reach in, that hook is reaching across to the other side of the barn, or where the angle of the barn, it's a corner. There's another hook you can reach in and unhook that hook. So it's a double hook entry. And this is frost on an old pulley. Oh, I just described that earlier. This is the corner of a barn, and apparently they didn't have room off to the left to put the hooks, so they just devised this going across into the beam to the inside and have the hole so you can reach in. I think that's pretty neat. Doors. So here's some cross buck style doors at a barn in Smith Valley. This is the barn at Scassa, the Scassa barn in Carson Valley. Isn't that a beautiful barn door? Very ethnic. It's thought that they were Swiss origin, and so there might even be sort of a ethnic statement about the construction of that barn door. And just a simple entry into a barn there. There's a chute. It's a chute. Inside there's a ramp, and these little doors on the outside of the barn could open, and you could back your wagon or your truck up to the back and take your sheep or your calves right up the ramp and into the back of your truck or wagon. And this is the Jones barn, and I call that the Zorro door. And found an old barn. I gave this slideshow at about 20 years ago at the National Automobile Museum. And immediately several people raised their hand and they, where did you see that? And I said, I won't tell you because I would like to protect the privacy of the private property owner for whom I had permission to go on to their property and take this photograph. But for obvious reasons, the folks at the National Automobile Museum wanted to know where that was. But I was true to word and I did not tell them. Here's a ironic side-by-side of two different eras of technology. Of course, a rubber tire and then the old wagon wheel. And this, I joke, that barn was moving really fast when it hit that cowboy. But these are merely harness racks inside the horse stall area of the Dangberg Ranch barn in Carson Valley. Wagon stories. The Chisholm Wagon. So I just wanted to mention the Chisholm Wagon. There's the lower right is Lauren up in the Chisholm Wagon that we now have on display at Bartley Ranch Park in the carriage house. And 2 summers ago, Debbie Hinman, another fellow Harps member, and everybody knows Debbie, really into history, she emailed me. She said, "You see this wagon for sale?" And I was like, "No." And so I call this guy, and sure enough, he has this Chisholm ice cream wagon. And this is Chisholm ice cream from Reno. And here are a few other historical photos of the Chisholm ice cream activity here in Reno. And that's a whole other slideshow. Point being, Lauren and I roared out there, bought the wagon, drug it home, and now it's on display at Bartley in the carriage house. And here we've had some open houses at Bartley Ranch Park, and this gentleman showed up, and he's a descendant of the Chisholm family. And there is our Chisholm wagon, and it's sort of a foreshadowing of my story here about our buildings at Bartley Ranch Park. But moving on, and here's another story. If you look at the tree, there's a chassis around the tree, and that chassis probably was down on the ground when that tree was first sprouting up, and that tree is lifting the chassis of that wagon right up off the ground after all of these years. Okay. So recall the photograph of the Valley Road barn with the wagon up on the upper left. And so lower right, I have a story. I When I was taking the photograph, upper left photograph, Mr. Raffetto kept asking me, "Do you want to buy that wagon?" And I would say, "Well, how much?" And he'd say 900, and I was like, I don't really have $900. And so a couple years went by, and I'd always drive by because I just loved looking at this barn, even after I got that photograph. And one day I drove by and the wagon was gone, and it was like being sucker punched. And I called Alvin Raffetto and I go, "What happened to the wagon?" He goes, "Well, some guy bought it and took it away." And he goes, "Well," and he says, "Did you really want that wagon?" And I said, "I blew it. I completely blew it because you gave me the opportunity." And he said, "Well, that's no problem. I have another wagon out back." And he goes, "Just come on by after work." So boom, right after work that day, I was there. And he takes me way out back, and sure enough, here's this wagon, and in the lower right, and it was just buried with just bales of baling wire and all kinds of stuff. And so we went out, a couple friends and I went over there and we uncovered it. And then Alvin hooked it up to his tractor and he drove it out and he parked it out in front of the barn and the hay boom. This is a hay derrick, this tall structure. And that is a structure that they would use to make haystacks out in the field, the loose haystacks. So you would load hay into the wagon, pulled by horses. You would have Jackson forks on the end of the boom. The horsepower would pull by pulleys and cable and lift that boom. They would lower Jackson forks, scoop up big scoops of hay, swing the boom around, dump the hay, and that's how they created the big haystacks out in the field. So every once in a while you see these old remnant hay derricks. So anyway, this presented a whole new photo opportunity for me. And I struck a deal with Alvin. I said, "Okay, I'll give you $300 every month for 3 months." And we shook on it. And sure enough, after the third month, I gave him the $900 and the wagon was mine. And so in the meantime, I was able to swing by and get some photographs. And just for context, if you look off to the corner of the barn, you can see Harrah's Casino. That's how close we are to downtown, to this old historic ranch. And so I give him the $900 and it's time to do what with the wagon? So I called my mom and I go, "Would you like a wagon in your front yard?" And she says, "Sure." So my next phone call was Ace Towing. And so Ace Towing shows up and we took the wagon, the hitch of the wagon off, because the total length of this wagon is something like 22 feet long or something. And so the Ace Towing guy shows up and he's like, "Oh, okay." And he loads up the wagon and he brings out his clipboard with the invoice and he has to fill out the invoice. And so he's like, "What's your name?" And I'm like, "Jack Hursh." And he puts the date and he says, "What kind of vehicle is this?" And I said, "Conestoga." And I go, "I'm joking. It's not a Conestoga, but just," and he actually writes that. And so he's like, "How do you spell Conestoga?" And I'm like, Conestoga, whatever. And he writes Conestoga wagon. And he goes, "What color is this vehicle?" And I said, "Wood grain." And he writes wood grain on the invoice. And so I sign it. He gives me my copy. And of course, that was the official record, a Conestoga wagon with wood grain color. And off it goes to my mom's front yard where it was for many years. And this is a picture of Grove Holcomb out in Holcomb Lane, circa 1910. In front of the Holcomb barn in his little buggy and a 2-team horse. And so we did a reenactment with Bill Thornton because Grove Holcomb is Bill's great grandfather. And we restaged with Bill parked in front with his modern jitney and other family members in front of the barn. And this is, some 97 or whatever years later. So anyway, Truckee Meadows Remembered. This is the name we give the nonprofit project for relocating the buildings to Bartley Ranch Park. And this photograph I found in the Humboldt County Museum, and it's just illustrating, not only do we have the big, large timber frame barns, but we have all these beautiful little outbuildings that accompanied the ensemble at a historical ranch site. And so this is a chicken coop at Sod House. And you can see all the chickens and turkeys and geese and it's feed time. And there's even a pigeon, it looks like, coming down and flying in, almost ready to fly right into her. And up on the roof are some pigeons. And above her head, way up there in the peak of the gable, is a little triangular entryway with a little stoop. And that's for the pigeons to go in and nest, because they would actually harvest the egg and the baby pigeons and the poop for fertilizer in the garden. And so pigeons were actually utilized in these old farmscapes, because at this time, pioneers, they were utilizing every resource they could. And so here we are with the Joe Ferretto Ranch buildings that are now at Bartley Ranch Park. And this photograph was taken circa 1950. And this is another one of those photographs that was in the family photo album of Kathy Zugar, who grew up in Reno and discovered that these buildings still existed on that bus ride from the Nugget, because she bought the little Truckee Meadows Remembered book at the Sparks Heritage Museum. And so this was in her family photo album, an in situ photograph of the buildings that are now at Bartley Ranch Park. And then towering above and beyond them is the big timber frame barn that used to be there. And for those of you that might have just tuned in and missed the beginning of the show, so this is where Lazy Boy and Ethan Allen Furniture Store are located. And we're moving in onto the story of the buildings that are at Bartley Ranch Park that I helped rescue and relocate there. And so here we are, Bartley Ranch Park, nothing going on there. And so we lobbied with Washoe County Parks to, we merely presented to them saying, we will do all the fundraising if you allow us to move these buildings to the park and set them up. So we went through all the paperwork and red tape to make that happen. And then I did all the fundraising, and I managed to raise $35,000 to get this to make this happen. And so this is December 2004, after the buildings had been moved to Bartley Ranch Park. And I'll begin to introduce the buildings. On the very corner, you can just see the carriage house, and then sort of front and center is the bunk house, and then the taller building is the chicken coop with the pigeon loft. So note the pigeon loft. And then there is the tool shed, and then a very small building in the distance off to the right of the tool shed is a very short lamb shack. And so these buildings had been at the Joe Ferretto Ranch. There were Lazy Boy, Ethan Allen Furniture Stores for like 160 years. They had been located there. They sprang up during the boom of Virginia City. They were in a big historical ranch that was producing goods for the market of Virginia City. The ranch changed hands through a few different families over the years. The Joe Ferretto family owned it for many years. So we refer to that ranch with that name. In the 1990s, when all that development was happening, Boomtown picked these buildings up and moved them out to Boomtown and set them up in sort of a little old Western town display, just for the fun of it, by one of their parking lots, just to add some scenery and romance to their setting out there. And they did that for several years, and then they expanded and kind of gave up on that idea, and they moved these buildings, sort of discarded them out into a field, which is where Cabela's is located now. And so the building sat there for several years, languishing. They were occupied by transient people, and it's a miracle they weren't burned down. The windows were completely busted out, the doors busted out. But Lauren John kept a dialogue with Boomtown, repeatedly asking them, please don't tear those down. Please don't tear those down. Lauren took me out there and showed them to me, and I was like, oh yeah, we got to do this. We have to do something about this. And so that was the beginning of our initiative. And Jack Sutton and Terry Sinar, Lauren John, and myself got on this initiative, and we raised the money, and we lobbied with the Parks Department to relocate these buildings to Bartley Ranch. So this is May of 2004, where they're literally being moved from Boomtown to Bartley Ranch Park. And so once we got them there, Lauren and I we sniffed out old windows, and we were able to find old windows that fit exactly in the buildings. And so we cleaned them up and repointed them, put new glass, and refitted them. And so here I am on the upper left working on a window, And then the lower right is after we have installed, you might say, a restoration, an arrested decay type restoration of an old window into the bunkhouse. And then there's Lauren. We got permission from various properties around the area to go and salvage materials because we needed old wood, we needed rusty corrugated tin, and we put new old rusty corrugated tin on the roofs of the buildings and did some patchwork with old wood. And here you can see it's starting to take shape. We had that buggy on display for many years in the carriage house, but as I mentioned earlier, the Chisholm ice cream wagon is on display. So again, on the far right is the chicken coop and pigeon loft, the bunkhouse, and the carriage house. Here's an inside shot of artifacts that we have been donated to us. The phone was ringing off the hook. There was an article in the Reno Gazette-Journal in May of 2004 illustrating our moving the buildings to the park and our effort to preserve them. And people from the community just started calling us, and I've got this we want to give you, and we'd run and pick it up. And then we would swing by the park, and there would be things just laying at the door of the bunkhouse. So we just decorated the buildings with the appropriate items. And so today we've got really nicely decorated buildings. And we have, during normal times, we have events. The park has events. And we run out there and we open up the buildings and we docent the buildings and interpret the history. And this is the carriage house. Another shot of the carriage house and the carriage house. Okay, the pigeon loft. Remember I talked about that pigeon loft? So the pigeons moved right in as soon as we got that building moved into Bartley Ranch Park. And of course we have an outhouse. And here's a picture of Terry Sinar in memoriam. We've lost Terry since that happened, but here Terry was Chief Executive Officer of the Outhouse Restoration, and you can see Lauren in the background. And that outhouse came from the Floyd Flannery Ranch over in Sparks when they're widening Bering Boulevard, and it would have gotten wiped out. And Lauren literally loaded up a trailer, went over there, and they just threw the outhouse on the trailer, and Lauren drove it back, and we built a foundation, poured some concrete, some ties, and we tied that little outhouse right down to a foundation and did a little patchwork on it, and it's as good as gold. And this is a random photo, and the outhouse is a two-holer. And one day we were out there working on the buildings, and this jovial couple just happened to walk by. And I said, "Can I take a picture of you too?" And we have some corn cobs in there. And so they posed inside the outhouse with the corn cob. And what's funny is two summers ago, this photograph was taken maybe 15 years ago. 2 summers ago, I gave a this slideshow at Bartley Ranch Park, and that woman was in the audience, and she had no idea, and I had no idea. And here I show this photograph, and she just screams, she's like, "Oh my God." Anyway, just a funny coincidence. And here we're doing some cleanup inside the buildings. We do an annual spring cleaning. And then we've had some events, 4th grade history tour, the Our Lady of Snows 4th grade. They really give or sort of emphasize history in 4th grade in local schools. And so we've had some field trips out there, and we've docented for the 4th graders. And this was a funny photo because they were just all standing there relaxed and just hanging out. And I walked up with my camera and I said, "Okay, guys, on the count of 3, I want you to just give me a goofy face." And I go 1, 2, 3, and went click. And this is what I got. And study every single photograph here. It could not be better. Look how goofy faced they all are. And it was that spontaneous. This photograph completely cracks me up. And so it was just one of our open house days tours at Bartley Ranch Park with the old buildings. And here we had Fall Festival at the Bartley Ranch Park, and some of the students coming by as well on tour. And Fall Festival, and we had deputy docents for the buildings that day, and some other deputy docents just coming and visiting at the hitching post. And then this character just jumped right up onto the hitching post, and I caught that shot of him. And this is really cute. Just one day, Lauren and I were out there working on the buildings, and Bruce Robinson, I had never met him. he just comes driving up in his old, super old Ford truck, and he pulls right up next to the buildings, and he jumps out, and he comes over, and he starts talking to us, and we're like, hey, and and he starts telling us that he used to work at this ranch, at Bartley Ranch, for Gus Bartley. And we're just going, no way. And so Bruce hung out with us all day long, just telling stories and telling us where the original buildings had been and where the bullpen was and all that. And Bruce repeatedly, all the rest of that summer, and actually for a couple of summers, we would call him and say, hey, Bruce, we're going out to the park today, join us, and he'd be there. And Bruce would bring stuff for us. And he brought us this blacksmith forge one day in the back of his truck, and he unloads it out of the back of his truck, and we have it on display there. And he was very proud of that. He used to use that. And so this is the lamb shack, and it came from a ranch out in Sparks, and it was going to be torn down. And so Lauren and I did a restoration on the roof of the lamb shack. So this was a little shack that would have been out in a field for a lamb, or for a mama sheep to go into for some protection while she is giving birth to the lamb. And so that's our lamb shack. And here we're putting the rusty corrugated tin to be authentic. And so I'm kind of sliding into home plate. I was just going to give a little brief history here on Bartley Ranch Park. These are some historical photos that of the Rossi family, John and Delia Rossi, circa 1919. And the White House in the lower left is where the Western Heritage Interpretive Center is now at Bartley. And so you can see in the upper photos, there are a couple of original structures that are not there at this time. They were torn down, but just a couple of historical photos from Bartley Ranch location in 1919. And this is my estimated ownership sequence, and it gives you an idea of a sequence of ownership for a ranch in the Truckee Meadows. So of course, prior to 1860s, the Washoe tribe, and 1860s to 1900s, Myron Lake, 1900s to 1920, John and Delia Rossi, 1920s to 1930s, Daniel Carroll Wheeler, 1930s, 1960s, Leo and Lina Biscaglia, and then they changed their name to, and those were the Gus Bartley's parents. And then Gus inherited and operated 1960 to 1980s, and Gus changed his name to try to be more American sounding. So they changed from Biscaglia to Bartley, and then 1980s to the present Washoe County Parks. So I illustrate this to give you an idea of exactly how complex really the history really is of all of these ranch sites that I've shown you here. There are many, many layers because we've had 160 years go by. And in that 160 years, you can have several families that have occupied and owned that property. And so it's really a can of worms if you really want to dig into it. And so Lamb Shack visitors, and I'm sorry, these are my closing slides just because this is so cute. Lamb Shack visitors in recent times at Bartley Ranch Park. And this signifies the end. And this is just illustrating a couple of books that you can maybe find. And I know Truckee Meadows Remembered, it should be available at the Nevada Historical Society bookstore. And I know I'm supposed to get it down to the Sparks Heritage Museum as well. And there's my email, jack.hursh@gmail.com. And I do have a website for Truckee Meadows Remembered, and it's www.truckeemeadowsremembered.com. And there's an email there, info@truckeemeadowsremembered.com. So you can almost revisit everything I've told you on that website with lots of photos and basic history of the buildings at Bartley Ranch Park and local barns. Thank you very much.